As far as I'm concerned, HEMA can be a broad umbrella term that encompasses a lot of different activities that have something to do with historical combatives. But there's one important condition, and that's that they need to be based on some sort of historical evidence. And that historical evidence also needs to be of some quality at the very least. Hello there, Oscar from Virtual Fechtschulen here. Now originally I was going to be putting out another video today, but the work on that took a bit longer than expected. So instead I'm taking the time to respond to the video that Shadiversity brought out a couple of days ago. Now this video has got some people's knickers in a twist, because it pretty much asserts, among others, that people who just play around with swords and try to figure out their own system of swordsmanship have as historically valuable reconstructions of martial arts as those people who study the treatises closely. So what I'd like to do today is just give my 2 cents on this particular video and address some of the points that I think need addressing. So for those of you who haven't watched the video and are not going to, here's a very quick recap of what Shadiversity has said. First off, the main argument is that pretty much HEMA should be an umbrella term. It should not be exclusive, it should be including all those particular activities that deal with any sort of historical combat. So not just studying treatises, what's considered to be mainstream HEMA, I suppose, but also HMB, playing around with foam swords, doing historical reenactment, all those things should be considered HEMA. Another assertion, and I think that's the slightly more controversial one, as I've already mentioned, is that taking an experimental approach is just as good, if not better, than studying treatises. First off, I don't really have that much of a problem with a broad definition of HEMA. As far as I'm concerned, experimental archaeology and experiential archaeology form a very valuable part of the research into historical combat. And the same goes for using pictographical evidence, secondary written sources, and even some archaeological finds. So if that's not my issue here, then what is? Well, there's a couple of assertions that Shad made that I think might need a bit of nuance, and that's what I'm trying to provide here. Now, the first thing I don't really agree with, because it feels a bit like a strawman argument, is the idea that HEMA practitioners are just about treatises. This is just patently not true, because a lot of high-level researchers and the people who train with them, and a lot of other people who don't necessarily do their own research within the HEMA community, they still make use of experimental archaeology, secondary sources and everything else, but not as the main source for their swordsmanship. What a lot of people do is they look to the treatises primarily, and the gaps in the knowledge or additional confirmation tends to come from secondary sources. So this idea that you're either in the treatise camp or you're just in your friend's background playing around with foam swords, it's not really true. Most people are somewhere in that middle ground, and I think that is a pretty good thing, actually. Now, the second assertion that I really disagree with is the idea that an experimental approach is as good or possibly even better than using the treatises to reconstruct historical combat. And I should probably explain myself a bit there, because previously I said that I do really enjoy having experimental archaeology and such as part of my understanding of what HEMA is. We have to really look at what is experimental archaeology to understand why just playing around with a sword does not really qualify as doing experimental archaeology. Now, experimental archaeology is a scientific method. It's used by archaeologists to examine reconstructions of archaeologically found objects and see if by using these objects in a certain way they can replicate certain traces that are found on the original objects. Ultimately, recreating the object as it was found means that the process that you used to get there is probably very similar to the process that was used on the original objects. So, as a clear example, if you go and play around with Bronze Age swords and you record your findings very meticulously, and I mean very, very meticulously, you might find that some of the traces that you create do not conform to what you see on original Bronze Age swords, while others do, giving you an indication that those traces that conform to the originals actually have been created in a possibly very similar manner to how the original object was used. That is experimental archaeology. It's a very highly scientific method. There's also experiential archaeology, which is more process focused. It's pretty much doing a historical activity with historical objects and then seeing how you experience these things. However, this is by its very nature a little bit less scientific. It's more process focused and more subjective, because the way to measure it is how you as an individual experience it. Experiential archaeology has its place, it's very useful, but it's not the greatest way to make conclusions about how to historically accurately use weapons, unless you put in a lot of other data to corroborate your findings, like an experimental approach, trying to recreate certain traces on the weapons that you use. So, having said that, getting together with a bunch of people and just picking up a sword and saying this is a historical object, then playing around with it and saying this works, therefore this is historical, is not experimental archaeology, and it doesn't really teach you as much about how swords were used historically. And it gets worse when you're using an object that's not really an accurate representation of a historical sword. The example of a foam sword, or a plastic sword, or even a blunt steel sword, these are not accurate representations of what a historical sword would have been like. You have to recreate the material properties, you have to recreate the sharpness that it had, and it needs to look and feel exactly the same as an original. And yeah, that really decreases the value of just trying stuff out, even though you're using a historically inspired object. Let me now just give an example of why I think some approaches are just more likely to yield historically accurate results than others. Let's say, for instance, you're interested in how early landsknechts around 1500 to 1520 would use their halberds in battle. Now, for instance, you could try looking at some of the treatises from the time, especially those written by people who have experience of earnest fighting and were possibly in a battle or two, like Hugo Wittenweiler and André Paurenfeit. Now, additionally, you could use experimental and experiential archaeology to using an accurate replica of a halberd used at that time to see if your findings corroborate the plays that are described in those treatises. And then additionally, you can use primary sources like Paul Dornstein's book on the campaign against the Danes and the Swedes to figure out whether that actually conforms to how these halberds were apparently used in battles. Now, this is a very holistic approach. And then on the other hand, you can also just take a stick and go in your backyard and try that out and say, well, sticks were historical and therefore this approach is also historical. That's not necessarily wrong per se, but I do think that the first approach has a lot more merit historically speaking. And I think we should not lose sight of that. Now, does this all matter in the grand scheme of things? Well, no, not really. And also, I don't really mind people calling what they do HEMA, even if that's just getting together with friends in the backyard and playing with foam swords. But I don't like a postmodernist approach either, where you say that anything goes, just do whatever, that is as good as a thoroughly researched historical approach. I disagree with that. I don't think that an approach based on very lackluster evidence is as valuable as an approach that does have very solid evidence to it, historically speaking. Right, so that was good to get off my chest. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope this will spark some interesting discussion as well. You might agree with me or disagree, let me know in the comments. And while you're at it, don't forget to like and subscribe. And finally, a thank you to my patrons. Thanks for your support. Anyway, keep safe, keep fencing, I'll catch you in the next one.